It is very important to have mutually recognized processes, systems, tools, and methods to improve the regulatory environment. Through the efforts and initiatives of the government, the Anti-Red Tape Authority launched the Philippine Good Regulatory Principles, or the PGRP, which provide a guidance to government agencies and businesses on how they should regulate and expect to be regulated. In this module, we'll look at the 10 principles outlined in Philippine Good Regulatory Principles in order to provide you a better understanding of the key elements needed to establish and institutionalize a sound regulatory management system in the country. The principles outlined in the PGRP are: Principle 1. Clarity. Regulators should provide clarity in policy rationale, objectives, goals, institutional frameworks, and support mechanisms. Regulators should take into account existing and other proposed regulations and whether they are consistent, aligned, and supportive of the country's overall development objectives. With careful analysis through the use of regulatory management tools such as RIA, regulators must ensure that policies are crafted to support capacities of both regulators and regulated entities to enforce and comply to regulations respectively. Principle 2. Legal and empirical basis. Regulators should ensure that regulation should always have a sound legal and empirical basis to establish a need for a new regulation. Regulatory agencies must be able to identify and establish a sound legal basis for all regulatory policies in accordance with the new mandate and functions of your agency. In other words, agencies should only intervene in instances when evidence supports that the regulations will address the issue or lead to benefits. Principle 3. Benefits versus cost. Regulators should ensure that the regulations will accrue benefits that will justify the least cost, unintended effects, and negative impact to the economy, society, and the environment, among others. When crafting or reviewing regulatory policies, regulators should take into consideration its potential impacts, cost, and effects upon the economy, society, and environment. You can better identify certain costs and benefits by consulting with your stakeholders. Principle 4. Assessment. Regulators should assess and consider all policy options, including non-regulatory interventions, through Regulatory Impact Assessment or RIA. We will be discussing more on RIA in the next module. Principle 5. Engagement. Regulators should ensure and sustain effective and inclusive stakeholder engagement. It is important to note that during the consultation process, all perspectives and proposed alternatives on issues should be considered to foster transparency and accountability. A feedback mechanism should also be set in place to ensure that stakeholders are informed of the corresponding actions or decisions of the regulatory agency in processing the stakeholders' inputs. Principle 6. Coherence. Regulators should avoid overlapping and inconsistent regulations. Regulators should ensure that regulations should be congruent and consistent with other regulations to achieve policy coherence. Principle 7. Whole-of-government approach. Regulators must work together to support regulatory cooperation in all levels and support regular and continuous regulatory capacity development initiatives. Before regulators engage in regulatory cooperation, role clarity is essential for any agency to fully implement its mandate and functions. Also, to achieve the objectives of this principle, regulators, both at the local and national levels, must adhere to a concerted effort of regulatory cooperation through an adoption of a whole-of-government approach as prescribed under Rule 3, Section 3 of the Implementing Rules and Regulations of RA 11032 and the ARTA Whole-of-Government Re-Engineering Manual, which can be downloaded on ARTA's official website. Principle 8. Continuous evaluation. Regulators should subject regulations to regular review and evaluation for continued relevance, efficiency, and effectiveness, and to keep pace with change from emerging technologies. we can ensure continuous evaluation by incorporating sunset clauses into our policies. We can set a specific time where a regulation will automatically expire or be reviewed. Depending on the scope and context, this can be anywhere from 5 years or more. Principle 9. Competition. Regulators must ensure that regulations are compatible with competition, trade and investment facilitation principles at both domestic and international levels. By doing so, regulatory policies for both proposed and existing regulations will avoid anti-competitive practices that hamper growth and the overall development objectives of the country. Principle 10. Risk management. Regulators should promote regulatory risk management at every stage of the decision-making process. It means identifying and prioritizing risk areas that have been known to cause problems. It also means allocating the necessary policy interventions to mitigate those risks. Regulators should also design and develop a risk assessment framework that will have a mechanism in place to identify compliance risk as well as an avenue for continuous review and assessment with all stakeholders. Taken together, these principles enable the regulators and regulating entities to create a synergy in implementing effective and efficient regulation for all. One must understand the objectives and roles of the others in order to come up with rightful solutions before execution. Now that we have seen these essential points that should guide our regulations, on the next module, we will look into the detailed approach, otherwise known as RIA, that embodies the discussed principles.